All right. Well, thank you for being here this afternoon. We're glad to report that this incident at Stillwater ended peacefully without any incident or injury to anyone in the facility, including staff or incarcerated folks. This incident started sometime shortly after 8 a.m. today when incarcerated men from one housing unit were released into the common area for use of phones, to take showers and those sorts of things. When they were asked to switch back in or return back to their cells, they refused. And that ultimately prompted the removal of the majority of staff that served that common area. 2 staff that remained inside of a security bubble or security room that operates the controls for that housing unit were safely contained within that room for the entirety of this incident. We want to be clear that never was there any deployment of any type of gas. Never was there the need for any type of entry by any of our tactical teams. That in fact throughout the incident, the majority of the time, the incarcerated men who did not return to their cells were at tables that are in the commons area playing cards, talking with one another. There was never any type of violence throughout the course of the incident at all. One of the questions that we did receive earlier was why were tactical teams called? First and foremost, the first group to be called out was the crisis negotiation team from the Department of Corrections. That's standard protocol. They began to work with and communicate with the people who are refusing to return to their cells and begin to address what the issues are and trying to determine what it's going to take to end the situation peacefully. Out of an abundance of caution, we also then contacted or called out our Special Operations Response Team, which would be similar to like a SWAT team. They came in, they were just held back for the entirety of this in the event that they were needed, but really they were here strictly out of an abundance of caution. Never were their services needed directly. In the end, all of the people who were refused, there was about 100 people in a unit of about 225 to 250 men, refused to switch in. Ultimately, by the time this resolved, just 2 people were outside their cells. When the incident resolved, they were taken to the facility's segregation unit, where they will be held for disciplinary purposes. But we're glad this situation is over at this point in time and it ended well.
Commissioner Chanel, we're hearing from advocates that the reason why these inmates were out and refused to go back in were because of the conditions. Brown water, no air conditioning, their windows don't open so they don't need airflow. And they're also protesting the fact that they're not getting as much free time, I guess, because of staffing shortages. Can you comment about those conditions inside?
So first of all, issues around water, there's not a factual basis for that. The water has been tested here, and there has never been found to be any issues with water whatsoever. As it relates to the issue of air conditioning, this is a 120-year-old facility. The windows, have many challenges. The way this has always been run is largely through trying to create as much airflow through the facility as possible. We have been looking at and doing studies to look at what it would take to climate control this facility in its entirety, and we'll be bringing that proposal to the legislature for a bonding request. This is not the only facility in the Department of Corrections system that is not climate controlled. And so this is a significant proposition. We know it's exceedingly hot in these facilities. We care about that issue for the sake of the people who live here, but also the people who report to work here every day. We know that it's really challenging. Finally, as it relates to the issue of staffing and free time, we do understand that. And this is an issue both in Minnesota and in every state across the nation. Right now, workforce challenges are a major consideration in public safety generally, and certainly in corrections that is also the case. We are actively involved in trying to really push recruitment. In fact, we have people at the fair throughout the course of this time, trying to really increase our recruitment efforts. You also have heard from unions and others about the importance of compensation. We recognize compensation is an important consideration, and contract negotiations are actively going on as we speak. So we want to have a stable workforce. We want this to be a good place to work, and we want the more staff we have, the more we can open up programming, which is exactly what the concerns of incarcerated people are. We understand that. We simply had to implement a more modified schedule for the course of this weekend, and we understand the challenges around that, but this is how we have to manage it in light of where we are.
What's the difference between the emergency lockdown status earlier and lockdown status that you're still under, and how long is this expected to last?
So the lockdown status that we're under now, the emergency lockdown status is once this happened, once this unit refused to voluntarily return to their cells, that's when the emergency lockdown status was implemented, meaning no other units would be allowed out of the cell after that point until the situation was resolved. The facility does remain on lockdown status and will remain under lockdown status. We anticipate through tomorrow until Tuesday. In that intervening time, staff will be working on plans for how that reopening will take place. The facility managers here will also be meeting with the incarcerated person unit councils. Each unit has representatives that they will meet with to talk about what this looks like. We want to have people active. That we know that when people are idle and when people don't have recreation, when people don't have access to those kinds of opportunities, these are the situations that happen. And we want to make sure that we're doing anything and everything we can to stabilize these environments, because it's not just good for our staff, it's not just good for the people who are incarcerated, it's actually good for Minnesota's public safety to have people engaged in meaningful programming, and that's the business that corrections is in.
Commissioner Chanel, Courtney Godfrey, Fox 9 again. We're hearing from advocates also who say you have resources at your disposal to reduce the prison population because they hear you're understaffed. Why not use those resources to reduce the prison population? Put inmates into community-based programs, for example, that are qualified for it.
Right. So we hear this a lot. We absolutely want to get people out when it's appropriate to get them out. But I also think Minnesota demands and expects that as we release people, that we have adequate safety nets in the community to make sure that we can address people's needs, because we all know that there has been a considerable amount of attention and concern about repeat offending. And at this point in time, we believe it's really important that we are smart about how we manage this, not just to release people to fail, and not just release people to communities where there isn't a support network to help them be successful.
Can you talk about what was the modified schedule and how does it compare to how it normally is, and what's the difference between the two?
So in a modified schedule, you might see people get out for, you're going to be allowed out of your cell, you're going to be out of your cell for an hour, hour and a half, phones access during that time. Maybe access to microwaves, maybe there's some exercise equipment in the common area, or access to showers, and people take advantage of that. And that can be several hours long on a weekend schedule when we're fully staffed. Now it goes down to about an hour, and so in order to get everybody out, so there's 200. Let's say there's 250 people in this housing unit. We release 125. About half the unit gets out at a time. Then an hour, hour and a half later, that second half gets out, because that's how we are managing the realities of having a lower staff numbers, and we want to be able to get people out of their cells.
Have you had to do that frequently on the weekends, or is it just because of the Labor Day weekend?
Well, it does, throughout the summer. Summers are the most difficult time. We know that, it's vacation time and those sorts of things. And, just being able to hire, recruit, and retain has been no doubt a challenge. And in the states that we've talked to around us and really across the nation, it's the same story no matter where you go. In particular in corrections, it is a big factor. I would just say that I'm exceedingly proud of the staff here today, who I think did everything to make sure that this ended well, and I think that's a testament to them. That's a testament to the commitment we have to try and make these facilities as safe as they can be for the good of the people who are incarcerated in them, as well as those who work in them.
We're hearing rumblings that now the inmates, it was a peaceful protest, but we're hearing rumblings of they're going to refuse to do those jobs, that the various jobs that you have for them in there, they're going to refuse to work. Are you guys prepared for that?
And those are the things that we will be talking with people who are inside, those unit representatives, about that, and we will have a plan to deal with all of those contingencies. This is not the first time we've had people refuse to go back into their cells. This incident just happened to develop in such a way that I think there was communications by people on the inside to both media outlets as well as family members, which ultimately turned this thing to become a far bigger incident, giving the sense that it was far more serious and risky, when in fact throughout, from the time it started to the time it ended, it was very peaceful.
At what time did it end? You said it started around 8 a.m.
8 a.m. Right around 3 p.m. is when everybody was locked in and it was secured.
And then the two who still refused, are there repercussions for the inmates who refused to?
Yeah, the two remaining people were taken to the segregation unit or restrictive housing unit. They're held there, and then there's a disciplinary process that they will go through.
How many officers were working today versus, and what's that a proportion of like normal staffing or ideal staffing?
Well, when you look at, I guess the best way to answer this, when we think about staffing here, the ways that we manage staffing when staffing is lighter is by doing less, providing less activities or less movement. And I think that's the big challenge. During the week, during the weekdays, you will see, and many media people have been here when there's been a lot of movement inside the facilities. In the weekends when we're contained, it's oftentimes each unit will have 5-6 staff in them. Each housing unit will just have 5 or 6 staff, but they don't have the same levels of supports across the facility.
I'm trying to get at what is like the staffing shortfall right now?
What are the numbers that were low? This facility is probably short about 50 officers that we have bona fide vacancies for.
Percentage-wise, how much is that?
So if we look at the Department of Corrections as a whole, right now our vacancy rate for corrections officers is about 14%. Which means that we have about 300 to 310 officers that opening vacancies. So that many vacancies exist within the Department of Corrections right now, and that does not account for things like people who may be out on longer-term medical leaves and those sorts of things.
I want to return to the heat for one quick second. When it's 94 outside right now, on a day like today, when it's 94 out here, how hot is it in there?
So probably the areas where the heat really becomes problematic is in the kitchen area, and I'm not saying that it's incredibly comfortable in housing units. You're probably talking the temperatures can get into the 80s. Certainly, we do have systems, because this facility is so old and because this has been a problem for 100 years. Over the course of time, there has been large investments in more air handling, more airflow systems, fans, those sorts of things. But we know that in itself is not adequate in order to keep the temperature at a reasonable level.
Are there areas that do have air conditioning?
There are a couple. The medical unit, the restrictive housing unit has air conditioning, but that's really primarily those are the only areas.
Any in like offices or places where officers are working?
Well, I think there's in the administrative office there is, but most of the officers are working in units. They're working where the incarcerated people are. All right.
Anything else you want to say about the staffing shortage?
No. Well, I would just say this: that we know that these jobs are important to Minnesota's public safety, and I would just say that in spite of things like this, what we would hope is that there are people out there who would love to provide good public service to Minnesota, their fellow Minnesotans, and do this work, which we know is critical, important, and noble, and can make a difference, not just with what happens inside these facilities, but more importantly, what happens out there. And that's in all of our best interests. And so we would just encourage people to at least check it out, join the team, so that we can avoid situations like this going forward.
Just one real quick. In the other facilities of Park or City, are there similar conditions with staff shortages, potential lockdowns?
This is a system-wide issue. I mean, some facilities have slightly less vacancy rates, a little bit lighter, but it is really an across-the-board situation. It's not staffing shortages. Vacancies are an issue every facility.
Are those other facilities in lockdown now?
I believe Oak Park may be in lockdown, but I'm not. I think that's the only one. But I'm not positive about that. All right. Thank you all. Take care.
Yellow.
What's that?